In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may begin from thee and by thee, be happy there through Christ our Lord. Amen. Our Lady, seat of wisdom, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, so these two conferences are going to be on how you find the mean in virtue. Because St. Thomas says that, and actually the whole moral tradition, Aristotle on actually, talk about the fact that in a virtue, specifically the moral virtues, it lies in a mean between excess and defect. So in the case of temperance, you don't eat too much food, and you don't eat too little food, you eat the right amount of food. And they also, of course, say that that mean is relative to the individual, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But in order to know what that mean is, that is where it falls for me or for you, how much food I should eat, is going to be dependent on prudence, right? And we've talked about prudence in the past, where you have to have memory and foresight and all those things in relationship to it. But then the question becomes, because people always ask me, well, I don't know exactly how much I'm supposed to eat and how much I'm not supposed to eat. Well, first let's stop with the 4 carton of eggs in the morning and 3 slabs of bacon. Let's start with that first. Cut down a little bit. All right. But the real question becomes, how does prudence determine that? And so what we want to do is we want to talk about prudence. In this first conference, I want to talk about how prudence finds the mean, and then we'll talk about the various things that fall under that. How prudence finds the mean, and then second, how prudence finds the means, and then we have to look at that in the context, because we want to see what messes that up. What makes us tend to think that, instead of, some guy sits down and he really should only have 1 Big Mac, but he puts 3 or 4 down, right? What causes that? We want to take a look at that. In order to be prudent, there are 3 things that you actually have to have. The first is you actually have to have knowledge of the principle that applies in the particular case. So here we're talking about a practical principle. So for example, what would be the practical principle in relationship to eating food? Health. What constitutes health? What's healthy for me? And that means I have to pay a certain amount of attention to my body and how it reacts to certain things, and I have to start cutting things out if it starts to become a problem, etc. But the principle is, in relationship to the food is there for the sake of health, so it's my health that's ultimately going to determine the mean on how much I'm going to eat and how much I'm not going to eat, which, by the way, this applies not just to temperance, but to fortitude, etc. So I have to know the principle that applies. Okay, so that actually has 2 meanings. One, I have to understand the principle itself. So an example would be, we'll take a very broad principle, do good and avoid evil, which they say is the first principle, the first of all moral principles. Although some argue that it's actually the good is that which all things desire is actually the principle, which is actually probably true too. It depends on what you're looking at, if you're looking at it metaphysically, if you're looking at it morally. But the point being is to do good and avoid evil. That's one thing. I mean, I can actually understand that, but I actually have to understand each of these individual terms. I actually have to understand what is really good and also what is really evil. And today the problem is that people tend to think, well, doing evil is a good thing. Or they may not formulate it that way, but that's the way they tend to look at it. Another way you can look at it more concretely, and so one of them would be, one of the moral principles would be civil laws are to be obeyed. Of course, that is not an absolute principle. Do good and avoid evil applies everywhere in all cases, whereas this one doesn't. But you actually have to understand what constitutes a true law to know whether you should be following it or not, and actually what obedience actually is. So in order to know this principle and understand it properly, I need to know all the terms involved. Now, in order to know that, in other words, the formation about moral principles come when I'm very young. So they usually occur, the parents apply the moral principles in the child's life before the age of 5 by punishing them So you associate pain with bad things and pleasure with good things, as Aristotle says. So that's where you start. But then once they reach the age of reason, you have to start explaining why it's the case. And then once they go through puberty, then you start, it has to be more by counsel, which we've talked about. But it basically means that there has to be a recognition, the child actually has to understand the moral principles involved or the precepts involved in order to know what is actually prudent. Because if you don't understand the principle properly, you're just not going to get it right. So another example is the fact that you have to attend Mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation, right? The millennial generation doesn't get it. They just don't think that rule applies to them. And they don't think the Ten Commandments apply to them, which is a sign that either they don't understand the Ten Commandments properly, they don't actually understand them, or they don't have an understanding of the fact that God is to be obeyed, which is another first principle. Okay. So the civil laws, so you have to actually understand the principle itself. We're going to talk about how today, this is where most of the problem is, even though there's other problems too. This is most of the problem where it is. The second is, then you have to know how the principle applies in the concrete, right? So you actually have to know how the principle applies or which principle applies. So, for example, if I'm standing on the top of a building and there's this feisty little midget standing next to me, and I take him and I throw him off the top of the building, right? Now, I have to know which principle applies, and that's going to be known through the circumstances. If it's an act of war, right, that he's a combatant, short one at that, but he's a combatant, right? Then I actually basically have to be knowledgeable of that, but then that's going to tell me the fact that the just war principles apply in this particular case, and how I handle him is going to have to be different than, say, outside of war. If I'm an executioner of a state and he has been guilty of a legitimate capital crime, and this is the way that, the judge says, you shall be put to death by being thrown off a building, okay, then my job is to heave him off the building, right? And so the principle, which principle applies, which principle applies will determine what the proper prudential thing is to do. One that you see commonly is in fraternal correction. So if someone is doing something wrong, and you know that they're doing something wrong, but you also know they're not going to listen to a single thing you say, then the principle that applies of fraternal correction is actually set aside for the sake of what? That you actually have to first prepare somebody to be able to be open to the information, because otherwise, if you don't, they could end up in a worse situation, and then you're responsible for that. So that principle of trying to lead people to a better state so that they can be open is a different principle than fraternally correcting. So which one applies is going to be done mediating the circumstances. So I have to know the principle itself, or the principles themselves, and then I have to know which one applies in this particular concrete situation, which you've heard me say, one of the things that came out in Amoris Laetitia, it says that St. Thomas says there's these general principles, but in the concrete none of them apply. That's actually false. What St. Thomas actually said was there are certain principles that apply everywhere in all cases, and then there's some principles that apply mediating the circumstances. So it's the circumstances that actually determine which principle applies in this particular case. And so, but the entire moral tradition has said that there's always some moral principle that applies. Okay, so whoever wrote that was being intellectually dishonest. Okay, the last one is to know how, okay, so if I know how to apply them or which ones apply, then I also have to have knowledge of the circumstances. These are the three things that I have to have knowledge of in order to be prudent. Okay. So, and each one of these are affected. There's blockages that can occur along this way. So when people don't know what the prudent thing is to do, it usually means either they don't have a proper grasp of the circumstances. So people say, you know, my daughter is saying X, Y, and Z. And so then I'll say, well, do you think she'd be open to the correction? I don't think so, or I don't know, or whatever the case may be, because they don't, in other words, they don't have sufficient knowledge of the circumstances. A lot of times people will contact me and they'll give me this whole litany of things, and then they'll say, you know, would you please tell my husband that he has to do X, Y, and Z? And I'm like, well, first of all, I ultimately don't know the circumstances, so how do I know is the prudent thing to tell him? Okay, so this is, so you have to actually have knowledge of these. Now, what we want to do is, we actually want to see these in the context of what can actually block those from being properly grasped in a given situation. Okay. And by the way, there is a reason we're going into all this. Okay. So, for those of you who have been to my conferences before, you've seen these. We have 5 senses. The 5 senses are then unified by the common sense power into one coherent image which is expressed into the imagination. That in the form of an image. It's also expressed at the same time into memory. And then the cogitative power looks at the image in the imagination, goes back into memory, makes the association of that content, brings it back in, and puts that in the image in the imagination. So this is how you recognize your mother, for example. Okay. This is all done at the physical level, or at the material level. Okay. Material. Once then the cogitative power can also make an assessment based upon past memories. So if you've had a bad experience with, say, Limburger cheese, then you smell the Limburger cheese, the cogitative power goes back and says, you know, last time you just smelled this stuff, you heaved. Then that image is put in the imagination of the heaving and that this isn't bad. And then from that perspective arises the emotion. Oh, I hate that stuff. Okay. So the emotion then arises in relationship to that particular thing. So we're not even done yet. By the way, I'm going into all this for a reason. We're not going to get into the agent intellect, but then there's the possible intellect, and that is the immaterial part of our intellect, which has the ability to grasp things like truth, beauty, and the like. These are abstract concepts. The agent intellect actually looks at the image in the imagination, draws out the nature, the conceptual content of that, presses it into the intellect, and once I have that conceptual understanding, I actually have the act of understanding. I understand this thing. I understand that this is a dog. Okay. When I see this 4-footed thing running along. Then this is all done at the level in the possible intellect. The possible intellect then makes an active judgment. It looks at the concept, compares it back to the image to make a judgment. This thing, this concept I have, this dog, this thing, is 4-footed or is, you know, furry or what have you. So that results in a judgment. Then I can also judge whether things truly morally good or not, not just because of the fact that it causes me to be ill whenever I see it. That's presented in an act of judgment to the will, to choose, and then the will moves the image in the imagination, okay, from which I can affect my emotions. Why is this so important? It's because of this. The grasping of the nature of a precept or a principle of prudence, like do good and avoid evil or things like that, is actually known here in judgment. But you have to remember that the judgment relies upon the image. So if I don't have if my cogitative power is messed up in the preparing of the image, by the disassociations it makes, then what happens is this image is not going to help me to make the right judgment about this. Okay, what does that mean concretely? It means that if I don't have the right kind of upbringing and right kind of experience, I'm going to have a hard time grasping moral principles well. That's what that means. Okay, let me say that again. If I have a lot of really bad experiences and my parents don't raise me properly, etc., when it comes time to make a judgment about doing good and avoiding evil, or, you should wait until someone is properly disposed before you say anything or something of that sort, then what ends up happening is because my image is, if every time I see somebody do something wrong and all I ever see is correction, then what's going to happen? My association is, when this happens, my judgment's going to be, my association is, all I've seen is correction, so my judgment is, you should correct the person. Rather than, and even if you tell them, the people that do that habitually, you tell them, you need to wait a little bit, back off, let the person settle down a little bit before you say anything. Because of this, always seeing the correction, if it doesn't get done right away, what happens? Well, there starts to be a desire for it, or there starts to be a fear that something's going to happen, something bad's going to happen, and so the emotion arises, and then the judgment is they go and correct the person when they should not have. By the way, I've seen that happen over and over again. Usually it's parents in relationship to their adult children after they've gotten out of the house. Okay. So, if you don't have the right upbringing, which then gives you the right kinds of memories, doesn't form the cogitative power to make the right kinds of association, then your images are going to be messed up and you're not going to understand the moral principles well. This is exactly what we're seeing today among the millennials. Not that I like beating up on them. Okay, maybe a little. But you can see this in them. You'll sit there and they'll say, the law is you don't go, let me give you an example. They actually have a law in Yellowstone that you cannot walk off these little planks because if you do, it's going to cause damage to the ecosystem, etc. The millennials regularly see the signs and just walk off. And the reason being is because they don't understand they truly don't understand the nature of a law. Why? Because they've never had to suffer the violation of a law. And so when they do it, they don't understand why everybody's getting upset that they're not following the rules or the laws. And so they literally do not even have a conceptual understanding of the principles of moral life. This is the problem. Which is why they're imprudent. I mean, you tell them, just start doing this. They just literally, they can't do it. Okay. The second thing then we remember, we have to have a knowledge of the circumstances. I'm going to jump down to number 3 first. You have to have knowledge of the circumstances. Well, how are the circumstances known? Well, the circumstances are known through the senses, through the 5 senses. And so, because the senses put me in contact with reality, I see the reality, it gets into my image imagination. But then, those circumstances, which are in the form of this image of my imagination, are then prepared again by the cogitative power. And if this doesn't do its job right, it's going to modify how I understand or put a perspective on those circumstances that is not going to be accurate. Okay, so let's back up just a little bit. When I go through this process of having this image and then I make a judgment, it's presented to the will, when I have an emotion, so the emotion, or the appetite which has the emotion, is moved by this image, this perspective, this image in the imagination. So it's moved by that. Okay. By the way, there is a reason I'm going this deep into it. Because what I'm basically describing to you is what every single human being suffers as a result of original sin and actual sin. So when the image has this perspective on it, I have this emotion, but then the emotion is then merged back with the image. So that when it comes time to judge the image, my emotion, St. Thomas says, draws me to excess or defect about the nature of the thing. So, for example, you've heard me say this, you mentioned fasting to people. Just mention fasting, right? Most people are like, oh, it's just terrible. I can't fast. Father, I can't fast. Yeah, you can. You just don't want to suffer, right? Because why? The emotional response of the sorrow of I'm going to suffer this thing results in that getting merged with my image. So when I judge it, I actually think fasting's worse than it is. So when you tell people you fast one day a week, except for when I'm lecturing or when I'm under certain circumstances, but normally speaking, it's one meal a day, 6 days a week. People say, oh, that's terrible. I can never get to that. Actually, you can get to that. Your body has to adjust to it, but you can get to that. But people think how terrible it is when it's actually not that bad. One of the things that you tell people, especially when you see this with people who are really fat, and then they go on a diet and they manage to lose the weight and keep it off. almost every one of them will say there comes a certain crucial period about 2 to 3 weeks in where you realize, I'm not going to die if I don't get my next meal, right? But the reason being, so the point being is that their image begins to change in relationship to that thing. They don't have the same emotion. So what's this mean? When I'm trying to grasp the circumstances, then the emotions, if I have strong emotions in relationship with those circumstances, it's going to affect my understanding of the circumstances. So let me give you an example. You go into a grocery store and there's a married couple walking down the aisle. And the wife does something or the husband does something and the other spouse loses all circumspection. They've lost contact, or they don't understand the circumstances. They've lost connection with the circumstances, and they just lose it and start yelling and screaming at them, right? Or you see this even with parents with kids, right? They'll just lose it on the kid right there in the aisle. And it's because, why? The emotion has made them think that the circumstances are such, it's drawn their judgment to excess, that this is really bad, and despite what's going on around me, this needs to be corrected, right? And so the emotional life affects our understanding of the circumstances. So two things affect it: my formation too, because if like I said, like if every time I see somebody do something wrong and I just see correction happening, then it's actually going to make certain associations in relationship to bad behavior. So I'm going to actually understand the circumstances, that these circumstances are actually worse than they are. This person did this, it's therefore worse than it is. Okay, so what am I getting? Between the association of cogitative power preparing the image and my emotions affecting my image, when it comes time to apply the principle in the concrete through the circumstances, my judgment is going to be off. That's essentially what happens. Okay. So then, number 2, which principle applies and how it actually applies, right? That is based upon the circumstances. So if I don't have a right read on the circumstances, or if I don't understand the principle right, when it comes time to apply that principle in the concrete, I'm going to be way off base, way out of whack. Okay. And so what I have to do then is, there's several things I have to do to be prudent. And we haven't even talked about how that's going to translate into finding the mean. I mean, we can already kind of begin to see it. You see this with people who, when they just first start fasting, and they've never fasted at all their entire life, one of two things will happen. They've read about some saint who, like Padre Pio, who used to basically survive off of communion and 1 beer a day kind of thing, which is true, he loved beer. But they would hear about that and they think, well, I'm going to do that. Yeah. Or because of that, this overestimation, because when they think of themselves, their image of themselves is much more inflated than it actually is. And so as a result of that, they think they can accomplish something more than it is. They don't understand their own circumstances well. So there's that component. But the other component is usually you get the opposite. Okay, Father, well, I thought what I would do is to start fasting, I would have, 3 full meals, and I'm snacking 4 or 5 times a day, and I thought I would give up 1 snack a day. Look, give up all the snacks and go to the church's fasting rule immediately. And they're just like, they half panic. Why? Because of the fact that, there's this perception of some future evil that I'm going to starve to death without eating this. And so as a result of that, their emotions arise with fear, and then they can't fast, right? Or another classic example is they start to fast and they start getting hungry. And then the cogitative power says, people who get hungry die and they starve to death, and you're going to starve to death, and therefore you had better go get something to eat, right? Rather than what? The will keeping its course regardless of how the appetites are all over the map. Okay. So the reason I'm going into this is because it's because of that. Now, it's because of that all of us who suffer from original and actual sin, it's why all of us suffer difficulties in finding the mean in virtue to one degree or another. All of us struggle with that. you're not going to be able to find the mean in how, because the principle is how it's going to apply, to what degree it's going to apply, right? I should fast. Fasting is a virtue, right? That's one of the principles. So if that's the virtue, how is it going to apply in my particular life? It's going to be all over the map if my emotions or if my cogitative power isn't properly trained. Now here's the thing. We've talked a little bit about this. Every time I commit a sin, the judgment about something is presented. So, stealing Bessie Sue's purse is a form of theft, right? So this is presented to the will. You can steal Bessie Sue's thing, but it's immoral, right? So the will actually has to move the intellect to change its judgment and remove from it, and to ignore, basically, remove the focus on the fact that it's evil and look at it only from the aspect of the good, which is contrary to reality, and then represent that to the will so that it can actually will it. So we get dumb every time that happens. But what that means is every time we do that, we increase the habits in the possible intellect. We increase the habits of looking at it that way. That means our judgment's going to be affected later. The second thing is then I actually will it, and I use my image to think about how I'm going to do this, etc. And so I'm actually training the cogitative power that when something belongs to somebody else, it's okay to contemplate the various ways you're going to steal it. As I do this over the course of my life, the cogitative power and the intellect become heavily habituated in that process. So that when it comes time to prepare the images, and it's very subtle a lot of times, to where we don't even notice it, even though, okay, I know I shouldn't be stealing her purse, there can be other things that can be happening. You see this a lot with, you see it in business a lot, where people are literally stealing everything in sight at business because of and they would never steal from their next door neighbor, but it's okay to be taking the pens and the stuff at work and things of that sort, and they're not even thinking about it. It's one thing if your company says, yeah, you can take them. It's another matter if you're just stealing them. The point being is that this cogitative power becomes very habituated. This is why when people start to overcome a particular vice, it's not just I've made a decision and therefore it's over with. Most people, basically what happens is, okay, so you've made a decision to start not stealing. Here's the problem. You see someone else's property and you've been in the habit of stealing. The cogitative power goes back and starts associating all those things with the stealing and all the emotions that arise from it, from the theft. And it happens over and over again. Even after you've gotten all of this straightened out and you've made a clear choice in the will, this thing is going to take a long time. The cogitative power is going to take a long time not to be making those associations. Let me give you an example. A very common one that I deal with is that you'll get people who are very fearful about certain things. And they get to an understanding like, yeah, it's stupid that I'm fearful of bullfrogs, which I saw one in the pool the other night, okay. So, I'm fearful of bullfrogs, right? And so, by the way, I'm not fearful of bullfrogs, I'm just using that by way of example. Okay, so, when they see bullfrogs, they tend to think they're much worse than they are. These things are dangerous. I don't think he's going to bite you. I don't know, man. Okay, so the point being is that even after they get to the point where they realize, okay, bullfrogs aren't dangerous, the next time they see the bullfrogs, they might intellectually say he's not dangerous, but then they get that emotional reaction to a fear in relationship to it, and they're fighting that, so that it can be these residual effects of the fear. Okay. Every time we sin, we train the cogitative power and our intellect along that line of that disorder. That means every time we sin, we're affecting our prudential judgments later. Okay. Because the cogitative power and the intellect are going to prepare the image so that we can make a proper prudential judgment about something. And as St. Thomas says, the truth lies in a mean between excess and defect. I don't judge a thing worse than it is or less than it is, but as it is. Okay. Every time I sin, I'm basically going to mess up those faculties and result in what? In it being harder for me to judge that thing in its proper mean. Okay. So, that means then, that's why we wanted to see this. I just wanted to draw this out. This is why trying to find the mean, trying to apply the principle prudently in the concrete situation is so extraordinarily difficult for us if we haven't been working on developing virtue and prudence and moderating our emotions and appetites, etc., our whole life. If we ever get to the point where we're just going to give in to our appetites in a particular area, it's going to affect prudence in almost every other area too, but it's going to have a huge impact, and it's a mess we're going to have to clean up later once we realize, okay, this was a disaster. Okay. So, that being the case, we're going to finish this conference with impediments to prudence. Impediments in finding the mean, right? What are these impediments that result in my not finding the mean? Well, obviously, the first is immoderated appetites. That is, emotions. So you always tell people, look, if you want to act prudent, the first thing you've got to do is you've got to get rid of all antecedent appetite. Now, antecedent appetite is different than consequent. Consequent emotion is what falls upon my choice. Our Lord and Our Lady had perfect consequent passion or emotion. But they didn't have any antecedent emotions. Those are the things that occur before my judgment or contrary to right judgment. Okay. So the first way to find the mean in a particular area, if I'm trying to be prudent, trying to figure out where's the mean in this, both in relationship to anger, how angry should I be, or how much should I be eating, or what have you. And ultimately, boys, the first thing that has to be done is all antecedent emotion has to be removed from the equation. So that's the first impediment that has to be removed. You have to get the emotional out of the situation. If you're angry, I mean, you've heard me use this example before. People get really angry, and then they end up making a judgment about it's just that I say this thing to this individual at this time, right? And then later they realize that was an unmitigated disaster. And they say things like, I didn't mean it. Actually, you did in the moment. Quit your lying, right? Because you hear spouses say, well, I really didn't mean that. That's not how I feel. It's not how you feel now. It's how you felt then, right? So quit lying about it. That's a psychological thing that from the psychological community they've kind of introduced, where, you know, you just say, well, I wasn't, you know, I really didn't mean that. Yeah, you did in the moment. But that's because you were acting based upon your emotions. So the first thing you have to do is get the emotions out. So if you find yourself angry, you got to check out for a little bit to get the emotions down, and then you'll be able to do what? You'll be able to look and see what's most prudent in the circumstances, and you'll find that mean. Okay, I shouldn't be angry, or I should express firmness in this area rather than no firmness at all. Okay, so all antecedent emotion has to be removed. But that then means that, so antecedent emotion is the first impediment to prudence. The next impediment to movement then is attachments. Any attachment that you have to anything is going to affect your prudence. Because why? Do you remember?
The attachments are in the faculties and they incline us towards their object.
Correct. So as a result, when you have attachments, that's what's going to cause the emotional reaction to certain things. So if you have a really nice Porsche, and then I come sit on a cassock, but I've got dust on it, it scratches your Porsche, right? If you're attached to the Porsche, what's going to be the natural reaction? Anger. Yeah, get off my Porsche. All right, that's going to be the natural reaction if I have an attachment to it. And as a result of that, instead of walking up to me and say, hey, Father Ripperger, you're scratching my Porsche, could you just kind of get off of that? Instead, you take out a gun and shoot me so you don't have a problem with it again in the future, right? You've gone a little bit too extreme, right? Okay, so what does that mean? It means that the mean that was supposed to be found in that particular situation about, you know, I should have a moderated anger, or I should, if you know that I'm doing it on purpose, all right, that's one thing. But if you're not certain I'm doing it on purpose, then what it basically boils down to, I didn't find the mean on how to address it because of the attachment that I had to it. So every single attachment is going to affect my prudence in finding that mean. This means that if you're going to be prudent in a particular area, so like say with your children, the first thing you're going to have to do in order to be prudent in relationship with them is develop a detachment from them and what God intends in their life or what He permits in their life. You have to gain that detachment. And then you can look at it more objectively, right? Okay. It's also true in relationship to spouses. It's also true in relationship to anything in life. There has to be a detachment in relationship to everything except God alone so that you can always act prudently. Okay. And then you won't have the emotions arising out of it. The third thing is any kind of vice. If there's any kind of inclination in the lower faculties, which by the way, attachments are forms of vices, but not all vices are attachments. It can be broader than that. The vice, any kind of vice you have in any faculty is going to incline that faculty towards immoderation, because by definition, a vice is going to one extreme or the other in relationship to the thing that you're trying to do. Because virtue lies in it, it's the mean between two vices. One is excess. So, in this particular case, the vice, the excess would be gluttony. The virtue is temperance. And the other vice is what? Starvation, basically. It's starving yourself or doing something contrary. You're not eating enough.
What do we call that, anorexia?
It's a form of it, yeah. Anorexia is actually, yeah. Anorexia is probably, we would say, the psychological conditions as a result of not eating enough. Okay. So these are the two extremes, and so the virtue lies in the middle, that I don't eat more than I should or less than I should, but as much as I should, or what I should be eating. So there should be a variety of different foods, etc., in relationship to what I'm eating. Okay. If I have a vice, it's going to incline me to not eat enough. And as a result of that, my prudence is going to be accepted. I'm not going to find the mean. So this means what? In order to go from this vice to this virtue, so Aristotle says you have to shoot for the opposite. So I know a gentleman who doesn't eat enough. So basically he was told by his spiritual director, you've got to eat more than you normally should, right? And the reason you have to do that is because then in that process you'll land upon the virtue, Aristotle says. As you're shooting for the opposite vice, you'll land in the middle in the mean for the virtue. So you have to start eating more. In other words, you have to start shooting towards eating more than you actually should. Actually, in this particular case, you're not eating enough, and so if you eat more than you should, you'll probably land somewhere in the middle. However, to do that is very difficult to know how much you should eat. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But the point being is that you have to get rid of vices which incline me towards doing those things which will affect my doing the mean. So I have these inclinations, these bad habits to doing something contrary to the mean. Next, okay, so I have to get rid of the vices. On a positive side, I actually have to work on virtue, obviously, which will the other virtues. So, and in relationship to prudence, there's other ways that you can develop it. The next is in relationship to the antecedent emotion, attachment, and vice. There actually needs to be a decision kind of made that you're going to, there has to be kind of a willingness to suffer. So you have to remove the horror of suffering in order to achieve this. Because if you're in one excess or another, then you're going to have to. Then anytime you go to the other extreme, it's going to be more. It's going to be painful. We all know this through experience, right? That after the Easter season and you have to go back on fasting, it's kind of brutal for a little while. Okay. But you have to be willing to suffer whatever it takes in order to find that mean, or to be able to practice the virtues so that you can get into that, fall upon that mean. If you're unwilling to suffer, what's that going to do to your judgment about where the mean lies? You're going to think the mean lies in an area of your comfort zone, essentially speaking. Okay. The other thing is that you really need to know your disposition, the negative aspects of your disposition. Because having that knowledge of it is going to give you knowledge of your circumstances. St. Thomas says our interior state, how we relate to certain things, like he says, like the alcoholic knows that he relates badly to the alcohol. And so knowing that helps him to know the circumstances better so that he can stand back and be prudent in relationship to the alcohol. Whereas if he refuses to really look at his interior state, or is really how he relates to that, then he's just going to end up doing what? Drinking alcohol excessively. Okay. So knowing the disposition, the negative aspects of the disposition, will give you an indication of, look, when I'm in these particular areas, so the guy who's really, really sanguine, he's just going to have to realize, look, when it comes to food, I'm probably going to have to go more towards one excess that is not eating enough, rather than worrying about whether I'm in this area. I need to probably get more towards the area of not eating as much as I should. Because why? Because of the fact that for him, food is just so awesome. And so every time he's around it, he's just going to eat it. And as a result of that, he's going to have to go to more extreme in relationship to cutting back on the food. He's going to realize, okay, so as a sanguine, I'm going to have to really work on curbing the pleasure I get out of food and detaching from that. So you have to basically remove the negative aspects of your disposition in relationship to that. So having this knowledge of these things will be very important. Okay. We're going to stop there in case you have any questions. I realize that was a bit of a load, but here's the notion is that in order to know the mean, I have to be able to make a prudential judgment. That judgment is based upon those three things, and those three things can be affected by disordered appetites, etc. And so these are the things you have to remove in order to start to even get clarity about where the mean actually lies. Okay. Any question? None? Yeah.
In this case about where emotions take over, you can be in kind of a disposition where your emotions don't have that hold on you.
Right.
Depending on, that's kind of like I'll go to Clear Creek, it just you just have a traditional mass that hold on. The Gregorian chant, all that kind of clears your head. That's
right.
To where these emotions don't have that attachment.
Right.
Where you're not so swayed by it. So there's something about this, I don't know if you call it a
some of it
kind of
is
state where
you
basically say clarity, like something's bring clarity.
Clarity, yeah. Part of it is you basically have to be solicitous of your circumstances. And basically what that basically means is avoiding the occasions of sin.
Okay.
Now, why is occasions? And by this I put in I make it a very broad category. And by that I mean this. Obviously, if I'm going to be prudent, say I'm an alcoholic, which I'm not, but let's say I'm an alcoholic. Obviously, I shouldn't be hanging around bars that are affecting my dispositions and therefore affecting my clarity about these matters. I got to get away from bars, the whole drinking scene. I got to get away from friends that drink. I got to get away from all of that first to get some clarity. and then I'll be able to see where any mean might lie. But this is also true on the occasion of sin, is also it's your circumstances. You have to make sure you're surrounding yourself with circumstances that are conducive to prudential living. This is why you don't hang around friends that basically share your vices. Because if you do that, then you're going to end up in trouble before it's all over with, because you're just going to reinforce each other. Or he's going to start talking about, the latest food he ate, and the next thing you know, you're down at McDonald's eating 6 hamburgers, right? So you basically, it's about avoiding not just the occasion of sin, but making sure that the circumstances you're living with that you only have to engage in those things that might affect your judgment when it's absolutely necessary. Like if you got to work, you got to work. You got to be around people that aren't the best, but that's just life. But on the other hand, if you have the option of getting away from those things to get yourself some clarity, that's going to help a lot in being prudent. You see this a lot with people who went off to college, went off the deep end, then they come out of college and they realize, I was partying too much, I was doing things that I shouldn't have been doing, I should have been hanging around those guys or girls or whatever the case was. And so the thing they realize they have to do is they've got to get away from that scene so that they can have some clarity about how they're supposed to act in life or where they're supposed to proceed. So it's a matter of getting those things out of the senses that are going to draw your judgment to excess. Well, if you'll kneel, I'll give you a blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti super vos et manet semper. Amen.